We're going to get started. It is, at least on my clock, it is 12:02, and I need to say Eastern Standard Time. Welcome to what we like to refer to as Ngoma Conversations. And Dr. Wise and I have been at these for, gosh, a couple of years now. And basically, if you're new to the party, essentially what we're looking for are a broad range of topics and conversations. Typically, we invite a speaker or a person to give a talk or a lecture. And I have to tell you, we've been finding some amazing folks, brothers and sisters from all over the country, and their topics have been phenomenal. So, although it is Black History Month, we're Black 365. So this is how we roll. This is what we do like all season long. We don't make a special effort for February. We just try to get, a great talk as we do every month. So it's my pleasure to introduce this brother to you all. And his name is Dr. David Walton. And there's been a lot of buzz, conversations, writings, dialogues on the academic level and other places about the impact of artificial intelligence. And I managed to find this brother. He's giving a upcoming talk in the future, and his talk is entitled "Deep Flakes: The Internet, Artificial Intelligence, and the Attack on the Authentic African Diasporic Identity." He's the director of Global Black Studies Program and assistant professor of history, Western Carolina University. And then I sent out his bio so that you have, and I don't want to eat into his times, but he has a number of accolades. Research interests includes hip hop, Black radical thought, the long Black freedom struggle, comparative Black history, transnational Black history, Black women's history, the history of Black studies, and Black studies theories. And we are excited about the talk that he's going to do today, which is a kind of a preemptive talk for the upcoming conference. So without any further ado, I am excited and delighted to welcome Brother Dr. Walton, who's going to give our talk, and he's all set with his PowerPoint. Let's give him a wave or a round of applause, and I'm going to mute myself. Nice to see everybody again.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Cooper, for inviting me. Thank you all for joining. This is a great honor and a great opportunity. Anytime anyone is interested in your thoughts and your perspectives and even research. So thank you all. My discussion is going to be kind of informal, meaning it's going to be conversational, although it is informed by Black Studies praxis and Black Studies key paradigms and theories. Uh, so I want to start artificial intelligence. As Dr. Cooper mentioned, in academia, it's a lot of talk about it right now in regards to how students should use it, how students shouldn't use it, or even if students can use it. And one thing about artificial intelligence that we got to keep in mind, and it's directly related to our conversation today, is what it does. Things like Chat GPT, things like when you go to use an AI generator to create images, or now people are using it to create art in a broad sense, rap lyrics, cartoons, poems, short stories, scripts. That's important to remember, right? That AI is being used in all of these different ways and will continue to be used in all of these different ways. But what AI does is it pulls from the internet what is on the internet and it draws from that and it comes up with these composites, for lack of a better way to put it. And that's where the danger begins in regards to the African diasporic identity. We all have done it. We all can do it now or do it after this talk, right? We'll do a search, maybe on Google, right? And it could be Black culture, Black identity, Black people. What is Black, right? Then you will see a bunch of stuff pop up. Some stuff will be scholarly, academic, rooted in primary sources. Some, unfortunately, much of it, if not the majority of it, it's going to be a lot of conjecture and opinions, right? And so we get a lot of falsities because those falsehoods are based upon white supremacy and they're based upon anti-blackness that is pervasive throughout US society, and in many ways throughout global society, right? And it's compounded by popular culture. I often discuss with my students the notion that what they are perceiving and presenting as Black culture is actually not Black culture. It is criminal culture, it may be hip hop culture, it is street culture. Street culture, criminal culture, hip hop culture are not unique to the African American or African diasporic experience, right? I often give them examples of I was born in 1975. I graduated high school in 1993. How the thuggish, ruggish white kids, white boys that I grew up with, they may have dressed very similar to us. White t-shirts, jeans, sneakers, a baseball cap. Fitted baseball caps were a big thing back then. Like Fred Durst from the rock group Limp Bizkit, right? Like Eminem, when Eminem first came out with Slim Shady, right? The whole, if he, the only thing that was different was their white skin, but they may not have listened to hip hop at all. But that culture, that street culture, that criminal culture, the uniform, right? And that's why it was dangerous that former General Jeffrey Beauregard Sessions, when he held up a picture of a black kid dressed like a hip hop artist and said, "This is the uniform of a criminal," right? It's conflating blackness with criminality. And also when former President Donald Trump likes to use the euphemism of urban as interchangeable with African American or African diasporic culture or identity, right? So I want to establish that first. Secondly, I want to say I'm going to focus on images and focus on currents that are on the internet and through social media and YouTube that many of our students tap into before they become our students, during the time they are students, and even afterwards when they're seeking knowledge and information, right? Because the young people, regardless of how we sometimes feel as older people, they're thirsting for information, they're thirsting for knowledge. And the question for them is that I pose to them is, are you able to adequately evaluate the sources for credibility? And are you able to dissect and analyze what is being presented to you? All tools that Africana Studies can provide to you. And I'm sure those skills are being provided to you by people like Dr. Cooper and Dr. Wise at your institution, right? And then lastly, before I dive right on in, because I know we got limited time, I want to first say there are great, good things that can be done and are being done with AI. So I'm not just simply bashing AI, but I also have to point out the dangers, and that's my goal today, and those dangers that affect the development of African diasporic identity and that I feel are attacks on African diasporic identity, because as we are taught as Black Studies scholars, that the whole racial project in the Americas, and particularly involving African diasporic people, was partly a identity construction project, right? We're taught this by W.E.B. Du Bois and Souls of Black Folk, Carter G. Woodson in Miseducation of the Negro, excuse me. We're taught this by Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Mass, The Wretched of the Earth. We were even taught this by Nathan Hare in Black Anglo-Saxons, right? Going all the way back to the seasoning process, replacing ethnic identity, be it Igbo, Mandinka, be Congolese, with the identity of the slave or the N word, right? That's key foundational understandings from a Black Studies perspective on this. So I'm going to start with an image you all may have seen on the internet many times. Dr. Martin Luther King in the do-rag, right? Now, obviously this is more Photoshop than AI, but this is setting the foundation, right? This is kind of where it began in recent times with the internet, right? The preoccupation and the predisposition to try to thugify or ghettoify Black leaders, historical Black personages, and presenting it as this is what Blackness is. And obviously, we all know who are from the African American community and others. You wear the do-rag, so a man wears a do-rag if he has a short hair, so he can get brush waves, right? But a respectable man, a professional man, would wear the do-rag at home, going to bed, but he wouldn't wear it in public, right? It became a hip hop and criminal culture public presentation, right? Because in the penitentiary, you're basically at home all the time. And I have relatives who served time in the penitentiary. And when I would visit them, I would see them in their do-rags and people in the visiting room in their do-rags all of the time. And in hip hop, it was popularized by people like Cameron from New York in the Dipset, as well as people like Nelly and his crew from St. Louis, the St. Lunatics. You know, Nelly's probably way more popular than the Dipset. So more people are familiar with Nelly. But that isn't simply the only ways it's used. I'm going to show another image. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, and we know the Detroit Lions finally made it to the NFC Championship, a half a game away from going to the Super Bowl for the first time in our history. And my little cousin posted this on his social media. And I was disturbed, and he didn't understand why I was disturbed. And this was generated by AI, right? And he didn't create the image, right? So I got to poking around and discovered that this image was created by someone putting in their AI software that generates images, right? Hood, Detroit, N-word, MLK. And this is the image that was generated and distributed throughout the internet, particularly for those who are in Detroit, from Detroit, right? Through social media. Excitement, ill-placed excitement over the success of our football team, right? And basically they turned Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. into a rapper.
Oh man.
As a representation of Blackness, of contemporary Blackness. If Martin Luther King lived today and was still a young man at the time of his assassination, so was a young man in Detroit today, this is how he will present himself. This is a Black identity. This is the Black identity, right? This is dangerous. Why? Because young people who are trying to sort out, determine, build upon, explore a Black identity, they're being overwhelmed. I couldn't pronounce the word I was looking for, being overwhelmed with imagery of gangsterism, of thuggish, of criminality, as being representative of Black culture, or more importantly to our talk, Black identity, right? But if it was simply that, the issue wouldn't be as dangerous. However, there's a growing trend that many of you all may not be aware of, some of you may be aware of the notion that we as African diasporic people actually do not come from Africa, and that we're the original Native Americans, right? That's something going on. Some of my students are presented to me, hey, Dr. Walton, what do you think about this? And then I always ask the key things. What evidence are you basing it upon? And then they'll send me links to YouTube videos. And it's usually one gentleman named Dane Calloway who's producing these. Now, because I live in the Appalachian Mountains right now, we have the Eastern Band of the Cherokee near us, right? And we have a reservation. Now, we know that the Cherokee owned slaves, and I'm not going to go into that long history. But my close proximity and coming from Michigan and being connected with indigenous Americans from Michigan, right? I'm in some, they invite me to these groups, Facebook groups, to address this issue of African descendant people trying to still appropriate the identity of indigenous Americans, right? And I know the root of it. They want to be anything but black, anything but descendants of slaves, right? If I was in the barber shop, I would said anything but the N word, right? You know, and in the barbershop context, it will be appropriate because it's communicating something to those brothers. Yes, we want to be anything but what white supremacy has labeled on us, and it's our respect deprivation, our self-hate, our lack of appreciation of our own lineage, our own heritages, our own cultures, right? Discussed by those folks' books that I had already previously mentioned, right, that are central to African American studies, right? So we're gonna look at a couple of those images. So, all right, this is the first one I want to look at. So this AI generated image is very misleading and dangerous. When a young person, and I've talked to my students, so I'm using their experiences to inform my assessment on this. When I say, well, what made you think this was credible? And they say, well, they have a picture of a black Indian, as they've called it, right? They have a picture. Look, it's real. And I say, no, that is not a real picture, right? And then with titles like "She Ends the Debate," right? Now, if you click on it and watch it, the woman doesn't look much like this, right? But these deep fakes, these AI generated images, right? You know, is very, very dangerous because those students who don't know, who are unsophisticated and or untrained, they're going to take this as being bona fide. They're going to take it as being legitimate. Another image, right? And I'm focusing on the Black Native American representation, right? What has happened in the past, and I couldn't find those images, but what this gentleman, Dane Calloway, initially used to do, and part of my research for my dissertation was based in South Africa. I studied a lot about the Amazulu people, right? When I went to South Africa those 12 times, at least 6 of the times I was among the Amazulu people. I saw their cultural ceremonies, their cultural production, cultural perpetuation. But they would often take portraits of Amazulu men in particular with their feathers and with their dress, right? That is uniquely Southern African, uniquely Amazulu or Ndebele or Nkosi, and etc., right? And present them as if they were Native Americans. Because many people couldn't identify, like I could quickly identify, like, bro, I've seen that portrait in South Africa in at least 100 homes, right? No, that is not Native American. That is Amazulu, right? So misidentifying African cultural practices as indigenous American to appropriate the indigenous American identity and undercut, attack an African diasporic identity, right? Because many know in the Americas, many of us, we have created a creolized culture because of the nature of the transatlantic slavery and slave trades, where we have cultural inputs from many African cultures throughout the entire continent, not simply West Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa, East Africa. If we look at the slave ship database and the slave ship voyages, we see where these slave ships were coming from, right? So we see this cultural input, right? But then we have these types of pictures, images, AI generated, that do the same thing, right? Now, this is clearly what a central, it began with the image of a Central African, right? as well as possibly even some West Africans, right? Because of their cultures of archery, right? We hear about Nzinga, right? Out of modern day Angola and northern Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, contemporarily, right? Archers, horse archers, right? We see in West Africa archery, right? Amongst men and women, right? So this AI generated image is drawn from these images of Africans as well as indigenous Americans and coming up with this composite that is even further confusing people, further undercutting or attempting to undercut an African diasporic identity, right? This is truly dangerous, right? And it's so many more images I can show you, right? That does this, where they do this, right? I remember a long time ago, meaning about 10 years ago, people were passing around a photograph, right? And they were saying that this was John Hanson, the first president of the United States. First off, photography didn't exist then, right? So how could it be that? Secondly, it was not of John Hanson. It was of another gentleman, right, who served in the U.S. government in the capacity leading up to the Civil War when photography was invented. And they say, oh, he was the black guy on the $2 bill, right? And when you look at the minting, there wasn't a black man on the $2 bill. That was the shading of the mint. So when you see it on the dollar, on the $2 bill, he looks like he's a dark-skinned person, but it's just the shading on it, right? So that has now continued into AI, right? We get images, right, of black people in European contexts. And then people are using these AI generated images to demonstrate, oh, black people were here, black people were there, black people were here, right? And much of it is false. And secondly, we do have legitimate images of black people in European royal courts that could be used. For example, the Portuguese royal court and King Alfonso II's children and some of the people in this royal court at the beginning of the 16th century, 1500s, before transatlantic slave trade even kicked off the way it did, that were there to learn the Eucharism and other things in Catholicism because he had converted his kingdom into Catholicism, right? We have those documented images. We have those documented images of during the almost 1,000-year occupation of much of Western Europe by the Muslim Empire of Black Muslims as governors, as regents, and in the royal courts. We have those legitimate portraits and images, right? But that's not their goal. They're trying to create a false identity, right? And attacking genuine African diasporic identity. So we even see foolishness like this. And if I was a Jamaican or a Jamaican American or West Indian, I would be furious. AI generated. The Simpsons in Jamaica, right? Look, now this is all of the negative stereotypes about things people don't understand about African spiritual belief systems, African diasporic spiritual belief systems, Santeria, Voodoo, Orisha, Oshan, right? These falsities, these, I call it the Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island bull crap that I got to unlearn my students and teach them about, in general context, about herbology and these things, right? That these things were, right? But they made them into the stereotypical racist, anti-Black notion of zombies, voodoo zombies in Jamaica, right? It is insulting, right? So the Simpsons in Jamaica, hey, you could simply say the Simpsons if they were Black, right? That's not a leap that I'm making, right? And it's connecting this all back to the negative stereotypes about Black people and our belief systems in the Americas, partly as a result of fear of Haitianization, right? But then even other types of images came across this. Huey Newton as Batman. Now, if we know anything about Huey Newton, I guess the only connection they could try to make is vigilantism, because the Panthers were policing the police and trying to get a grip on narco trafficking in the black community. But Huey Newton was a Maoist, right? An anti-capitalist. Batman was the billionaire who used his money and in many ways police brutality, but he wasn't the cops, right? So this wave of vigilance. Bruce Wayne in many ways was Kyle Rittenhouse. If we're using our analytical minds, right? Right? I mean, the absurdity of this, trying to connect a black radical person to a billionaire vigilante, right? That is too an assault on black identity, particularly a black radical identity, right? So we got this Europeanized black woman. This is a white woman, in my opinion, with brown skin. They did give her some black people lips though. So I guess that's right. I mean, based on phenotype, right? They did do that. But the hair, right? I mean, this is a false identity. This is a false narrative, right? This can definitely, I have a 9-year-old daughter, right? And hair is a big issue, right? People touching her hair, make sure her hair is done, protective hair styles, those things that I learned having a daughter, right? This would definitely assuage her identity. This is beautiful, daddy. My hair doesn't look like that. Mommy's hair doesn't look like that. Grandma's hair doesn't look like that. Other grandma's hair doesn't look like that. But this is being presented as a beautiful black woman generated by AI. Now, I'm not saying some black women don't have hair like this, right? That some African women do not have hair like this, because they do. And black people, we come in all hues, we come in all hair types, right? Because of our experiences as a result of the Atlantic encounter, right? So I'm not saying that. But when we're talking about black identities, black standards of beauty, Africana standards of beauty, right? Man, Marcus Garvey would weep. Both of his wives, both of the Amy's would weep, right? Seeing this. Betty Shabazz would weep seeing this, I believe, right? But I wish that was just the last one, right? All right, hold on. I got to share better than that. I'm sorry. Here we go. Right. Now, we are aware of the history of black cowboys and black people in the West, right? Black African Americans and Mexican Americans and Mexicans created cowboy culture, right? I'm going to mispronounce the word, but it's based upon the Spanish word for cows with the masculine ending, right? That you learn. That is the origins of cowboy culture in the American West. Mexicans, black people, right? This image isn't all bad, but it's too problematic. They have the sisters dressing like they about to go to a rap video, to a twerk off. It's Meg Thee Stallion from Texas, right? And she's from Texas, right? I mean, it's insulting, right? It's beyond problematic, right? It doesn't represent actual true imagery and how black women dressed in these conditions in the old West, right? It's a falsehood. And then we have images. Whoops. We have images like this. And all I could do was sigh. Right. European, Victorian Europe. Right. This is the imagery. And I blame things like Biggerton and even Hamilton to a degree, and these things with that that present these false historical things, these ahistorical things, in certain Black people into context, right? That reduces their African diasporic identity and their Africanness, their Blackness, right? And this is how I view it. Oh, yes, the hair is beautiful. My daughter would love the hair, right? But the clothes and the representation, right? Why can't they? Why couldn't she be wearing an outfit like Sister Lois, right? Like she has beautiful African print. Why can't that be the representation? Why must the representation be to what is glamorous in the European context? What is glamorous in the European context, right? And I don't have many images left. I believe this is the last one. So our Black warriors, the warrior spirit for freedom in Black people, right? And they have a series of photos, so this surrender is out of context. So ignore that surrender because they have a series of photos. I just didn't want to show them all, right? But look at these Black people during medieval times, knowing back in Africa we were doing great things, right? Because in part they didn't suffer from the Dark Ages because of Catholic suppression, right? So things, cultural development, scientific, and art kept developing in a trajectory. But they got them dressed like King Arthur, Sir Lancelot, right? Nowhere in any African cultures that I've studied did Africans wear this type of armor. One, it will be too much of a burden in the African context. Part of the reason during the Crusades, the European knights took off this armor, fighting in Palestine and other places, right? They didn't wear this armor. The Knights Templar didn't wear this armor because unlike Europe, the conditions were different and it was a burden. It was not a benefit to them. But this is the type of imagery. And I could have showed you images of Black people in Japan, right? We're aware of Black samurai, but not very many, right? And it's a result of many reasons that we had the Black samurai. Slavery through the Arab slave trade, the Silk Road, and all of those things, right? But then you have false pictures, false images created by AI, right? And none of it is rooted in actual African diasporic experiences, African diasporic identities. It's based on a fantasy, right? But there are a lot of images where generated by AI where you'd be like, oh man, that's a good image. It's reinforcing an African identity and African diasporic identity. But we also have these negative images, right? And that's shaping young people's identity formation. My 9-year-old daughter, right? Her classmates, right? A 5-year-old, a 6-year-old kid, right? This is shaping their identity, but it's not rooted in reality. And those other images are actually assaulting and attacking the development, establishment of an accurate, positive identity. Because Afrocentricity isn't trying to take credit for things that were not done by African diasporic peoples. Afrocentricity is not trying to appropriate another group's culture or another group's experiences. It's centering ours. It's having confidence and pride in ours, right? And then that allows, as Malefi Asante would say, us to then interact with other groups, have these multicultural contacts, right? Be healthy for us. These images reflect that unhealthiness, right? That lack of confidence and that lack of pride, right? That's the danger of not having that centeredness when we have these multicultural contacts. And I'm going to end it with this. Just take it like, oh, we're having a potluck, a multicultural potluck, food of the world, right? I laugh at those things, but they do bring people together, right? If you view African American cuisine simply as being slave food without knowing that those dishes, right, were they used in recipes from Africa, but they had new ingredients, so that created new dishes, right? Because they had to use new ingredients, right? So they're just as much. That cuisine is just as much in African cuisines, African diasporic cuisines, right, as any other African diasporic cuisines. But we say, oh, it's slave food, reducing it to that because of our lack of confidence. So you're going to this potluck and you're amazed. Oh man, that food from Japan was awesome. That food from Mexico was awesome. That food from Italy was awesome. And all we have is slave food, right? You can't have that positive multicultural experience. It's jealousy, envy, which leads to appropriation and self hatred, right? And I believe AI has that danger if we don't pay a keen eye to it, if we don't inform the community and inform our students of those dangers, right? That these deep fakes in the internet, right, will continue to serve as a tax on a genuine and authentic African diasporic identity. And then I'm going to wrap that up there to leave time for questions and answers.
Wow. Um, let me say this. I want to open up the floor to questions only because I have 40 myself. And I'll see if I can circle back to one of mine just to get the reaction. I would suggest at the upcoming NCBS conference, your work is superb, and I think it illuminates things that I had just never considered. Let me just see if there were reactions on the floor. I see a chat. Great presentation. Thank you. Very informative. I'm going to put a question on the floor if I don't see somebody with one of my 40. Here's a quick one. Here's a quick one. And certainly you've heard this before. Um, and I think you've kind of alluded to this. So part of what we're seeing is the continuity of a misrepresentation of African identities that's taking many forms, not unlike caricatures we saw in the 30s, 20s, and 40s of Sambos and the whole, I'm preaching to the choir, the whole litany of things. And I say this to my students all the time. When you understand the history and the wickedness involved in oppressing us, then you see the continuity. I guess, why is there a particular concern about AI when you look at the continuity of things like this that have been done for a very long time?
Mhm. I mean, and then they're drawing when they make these images or make these short essays, right? They're drawing from the internet, so they're also drawing from those negative images, those negative stereotypes, those negative representations as well, right? Because that's what AI does. So it's that continuity, and it's not abstract. They're drawing directly from those minstrelsies and misrepresentations of the past, going back to the late 1800s.
And do you see this as much worse or a particular concern? Because we would argue um, that Black people and others have brought into this kind of self-hatred in part because of the history, and then
Mhm.
this is a newer innovation. What makes you particularly concerned with AI above and beyond what we already have seen?
Partly because it was easily recognizable by African Americans and African diasporic people that the minstrelsies were false representations, right? And we had people like Oscar Michaud, we had the New Negro movement that directly combated those representations. The danger with this is that young people or people in general do not or may not readily recognize the danger or the misrepresentation or the harm, and then approach it from the opposite way where they think these are positive, accurate, true representations, right? And that's where the danger is. The notion of I'll frame it this way, right? It was a time. So I'm going back to some research that I've done and I'm still doing related to my dissertation, Black Power Movement in Detroit. Student case study, Black Student United Front, push for Black studies in Detroit public schools, right? In their newspapers, they were attacking the cool, as they called it, the cool N-word motif and imagery, the way they dress, the black exploitation, the fantasies of a white male mind for most of those black exploitation movies, written and directed by them, right? Like like Superfly, right? That's out of a white man's imagination, right? Right. So they were attacking those things, right? Saying we want true representation, right? So now what is happening is authentic blackness is being presented as a representation of modern day black exploitation imagery, right? You're not a real black person. You're not a real N-word, to use the rap talk and the street talk, right? Because you dress a certain way. Oh, you have a button-up shirt with African print on the collar, Dr. Cooper. Or Richard ain't a real N-word. Richard ain't a real, oh, he bougie, he this, he that, right? It's like, wow, it's very disturbing, to put it lightly. Very, very disturbing.
Great. Sister Erica, feel free to introduce yourself and your question or comment.
Good afternoon. My name is Erica Holmes, and I want to first thank you for sharing the information. It's a great presentation. As you went through and you mentioned some of the incorrect time periods of clothing and such, it made me wonder, as I was looking at the incorrect version, it made me wonder if you had a picture of the correct version to inform me of what it should be during certain time periods or in certain regions. And I think, that would be very interesting also to see. So then I think I could then recognize, oh, that's incorrect because I've seen the real version of or real representation. So that's what I was wondering.
Indeed, I didn't have any prepared, but I will do that and keep that in mind in preparation of when I give this presentation again. And I'm sorry that I didn't have any prepared. I didn't even think that might be a good idea. So thank you, my sister, and I apologize for not having them at the ready.
No, thank you. This was great. Now it makes me want to go and research and
Sister Tangela.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Professor Walton, thank you so much for the presentation. It was very enlightening. I guess my question would be, and you kind of answered it, but again, repeating it is good for us, right? Who is just getting this this perspective for the first time. But how do we as Black people appreciate and engage in American culture, right? And holding true to the beauty of Black culture, right? Because when you brought up the example of Bridgerton, I'm like, oh my goodness, I love that, right? I didn't even know, right? I wasn't even cognizant of the damage that it was doing. And so I just, the duality of being Black in America and still trying to hold on to a sense of Blackness and Americanness, what do you say to that?
That's a great question, right? And we're talking about it, and we all suffer from it. We're talking about that double consciousness, right? And we would be arrogant and dishonest if we didn't say we all suffer from it. I'm wearing a polo style shirt and a ball cap. I don't walk around in my dashikis every day, right? But being able to just acknowledge and appreciate the difference between reality and fantasy, right? Between nonfiction and fiction. Being able to point that out, I consciously and have our mind trained subconsciously and communicating that to our children. For example, right? I mean, we may, watch a show. It's a show I like. Uh, Ring the Wheel. I mean, what is it called? The Witcher, right? It's a show, and it's in the fantasy Europe, right? And then and they have these African diasporic people popping up in these different capacities, right? But I have to remind myself that hey, this is fantasy. This isn't reality, and I can enjoy the fantasy, right? Lord of the Rings, right? I can enjoy it, but I definitely was like the orcs is a racist representation of black people because Peter Jackson used that same makeup in King Kong to represent those indigenous African people on Kong Island or Skull Island, right? The same exact makeup, although I love the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, both trilogies, right? Uh, but being able to, recognize it and pointing that out to my son, like, hey, this is what's going on, son. He's a freshman in college now, so he was younger when we would go see those movies at the theater. But being able to point it out to him, like, hey, son, this is what's happening. Be clear. So then when the Power of the Rings came out and they had black elves, I said, son, that is a response to the backlash to the racism that we saw presented, and people like me and others who are fans on these Reddits and stuff point out, hey, that was a racist representation of black people, and y'all not slick. Right? So that's all. I had to do that with my son with Hamilton. I was like, yeah, Hamilton wasn't black, brother. So I know the guy singing is black, but he wasn't black. It's a representation. It's a fictional representation, So we got to be mindful of that, and that will help us then when we watch and engage in art as observers of art. We will also keep our eyes open for that, right? Keep our eyes, because it's a reason you have the Ankh on, right? You want a representation. It's a reason that you have, that you're wearing it as a shawl, right? Me as a Muslim, I have several of those, right? It's a reason you're trying to use an aesthetic that's authentic to your cultural heritage, right? So it's the same thing when we see something out of place, like, hey, that's cool, but that isn't really authentic, representation.
If I could, Dr. Cooper, one other question. I don't mean to take up too much space, but I know you said you're still doing research, but is part of that research going to extend into like how we're being socialized now to be like this racial ambiguity, right? Like people can't tell what race people are, or does that play into the anti-blackness too that we see?
It certainly does. And I was going to show some of those images, but context of time, AI generated images, right, of these. They look like Barack Obama or Drake or right or what's the lab Ice Spice Lottos or whatever, right? These ambiguous. They could be anything, right? They could be indigenous American. They could be Arab. They could be Persian, right? This just right, and they're using definitely. I mean, we see it in advertisements and advertisements, right? I mean, I see white people complaining, the death of white couples in ads, and I'm like, well, I'm seeing the death of black people in ads. I'm seeing this, what we would call growing up in Michigan, because Canada, in Detroit, Canada is right across the river, right? We used to call them grays, right? The gray girls or the grays, well, you couldn't tell what they were, right? Either they were mixed race or multiple generations of mixed race, right? But it's that representation, and they say, that's diversity, that's color, that's black people. We have people of color. They have people of color, but they don't have people that may necessarily look like us.
So we have a couple, see if we can get to them. We know some people have to leave at 12:50. I'm going to try to get these 3 questions in, and then we'll call it a wrap. How do students react to you as a professor when you dispel these myths? One of the questions.
Oh, they generally respond well because I back it up with stuff that's rooted in what was been assigned readings up for the week. And then I back it up with primary sources in some cases, like when they say, hey, I'm Native American, I'm not black. And then, then I go through the primary sources. Hey, look at these slave ship manifests. You saying that the slave trade didn't exist, it's all a hoax. Hey, look at these manifests. You're saying that you are Cherokee. Hey, well, let's look at this. No, your people were slaves to the Cherokee, and because of the treaty at the Trail of Tears, the U.S. government said, we're not taking your surplus Negroes. You can't have slavery. They must become citizens of your ethnic group, of your nation. So they are citizens, but they are not ethnic Cherokee. So I just use primary sources and rooted it in the readings to dispel some of these myths that students bring with them to the class.
Excellent. Another question, Professor, do you see the iconography in children's books improving in 2024 and beyond? What can we do to better promote and empower authentic imagery and illustration?
Awesome. I do see it improving because we're now having a revitalization, a renaissance of Black people actually writing children's.
There's no detox for amphetamine.
Because I'm seeing, even on my timeline, I'm seeing more and more couples, parents writing children's book. I'm seeing more and more a parent and a child writing children's books together, and et cetera, et cetera. And I buy a lot of them for my daughter because she loves to read, and definitely she likes the books that she can see herself in. So I believe the iconography is improving. I believe it will continue to improve. Part of the way we can guarantee that is we got to have our local libraries, our university libraries, and then ourselves actually going out and purchasing these Black written, Black children, Black centered children's books.
Excellent. So we're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat as they are streaming by. And of course, a lot of people have to leave at 12:50. And I will withhold my desire to ask another question, but I would encourage others in a day or two, we'll have the link, a YouTube link where you can share this and or watch it again. I can't thank you enough, brother Dr. Walton, for your research, which is superb. And I think you've laid a foundation for an area and an impact that I just simply had not considered. And particularly to the magnitude. And we so appreciate your willingness to kind of give an appetizer or a teaser before your formal presentation, and your willingness to dialogue with us. We can't thank you enough, brother.
Oh, well, thank you all. I can't thank you all enough. And it's only because of my children that I even paid attention to it, because I would see it. I would see it on social media, didn't think twice about it, but all my misguided brothers, and sisters, right? Like, man, if they would just take a class, or why wouldn't they listen to me when I was in college and I'd come home and we'd stand on the corner and drink malt liquor beer together. They wouldn't listen to me then. Now they want an awakening, which is good, 30 years later, but they fallen victims. But it was really my children pointing out these things to me, like, hey, Dad, what is this? That really made me start paying attention.
Excellent. And please know, Dr. Walton and others, you all can